Yeah, my name is Ted Davis. I'm a media artist and designer from the U.S., based in Basel, where I've been for the last 10 years. I moved there in 2007 to 2009 to do a master in visual communication, and soon after began teaching and doing research in the field of new media interaction design. Yeah, I'd always heard of Basel in our history books, especially for design, for the movements that had taken place there. But they had just started a master program, and it was a random coffee with a previous professor of mine that told me about this program that was starting. And 2 weeks later, I took off to go there. I had been wanting to move to Europe for some time and was looking in Italy at programs. And then when I learned of this opportunity, jumped at it. And yeah, I've been comfortable there ever since. Yeah, I would place my art in the realm, there's a few categories. One might be in the realm of glitch or error, and that's how I got started into the more artistic side of new media. That's about opening up and manipulating digital files, and so incorporating errors, forcing errors to be surprised with what happens when the computer translates these manipulations in the data. Another realm I've been really interested in is generative, and that's based on programming, basically building from scratch the images, the forms, using code basically as the medium for creating an image or audio. A glitch is basically an error or Fehler. It comes from the word glitchen, from Yiddish or German, and it basically is about the exploitation of errors. So our software is constantly trying to squish these and make sure that they don't happen. Our video player gets smoother and smoother where it never hiccups. And in glitch you can, basically every data that's on your computer, you have the possibility to open it up. It's ones and zeros, and you can put an influence, force an influence in there and be surprised on what happens on the surface. So it's been existing much longer in music, because in music there's electronic signals going by, and it's quite easier to put a spike in there to influence the signal. And I would say since the early 2000s, the visual side of glitch has been a thing. And so it was in my thesis that I focused on specifically the JPEG and what was possible through manipulating the instructions of it or manipulating the content or the body, just to be surprised. Because to me it was a big question, what is an analog picture versus what is a digital picture, and why do we treat all of our digital pictures the exact same way as analog? In Photoshop we see darkroom tools and we're cropping things, we're doing things as though it was analog. And to me the glitch was the first convincing perhaps path to say this is really a digital image. Through these artifacts we can exploit the fact this is digital and not treat it like its analog counterpart. I found myself always being on the border between art and design. I studied design, visual communication, but I've always wanted to minor and be on the side of art, partly from the freedom it has in terms of execution and expression. And in my undergrad, I was fortunate to be able to take many sculpture classes, printmaking classes, and I think a big influence had been a sculpture class based on sound, which was a wild idea to me, that sound as sculpture, what does that mean? And in the course we got introduced to how rich a medium sound is and how rarely it's used as an element. It's used often, but not so often that we see in museums, and how this extra medium can play a big role in having influence over the visitor. And so that sort of stuck in the back. Maybe when I went to do my master in Basel, I was still on this fence, design or art, and the master was focused on the image, sort of what does the image mean? And to me that was the perfect focus where it could be applied in either territory. And it was in my master that then I realized what I'm making has less direct application, and through programming that started to open up more and more experimental possibilities. And then that was a slippery slope to becoming my own client and just experimenting, playing with code, testing things out, and sort of falling into very experimental possibilities of making an image that tended to lean towards the artistic side rather than the design side. My path into programming began as a teenager, learning how to do websites and learning about the possibilities of the web, and I thought that was coding, so I was already putting that hat that I'm a coder, and then later realized, no, that's not coding, that's markup language, it's something else. And it wasn't until in my master's studies that I was exploring glitch and wanting to turn sort of hand process manipulations to an image. I wanted to make 256 changes to a little part of an image, and it took 5+ minutes or longer, a half hour at the beginning, to make these kinds of changes. And I knew programming could do these kinds of tasks for me. And so I started researching what does it cost to hire a programmer, and quickly found out that's not in the cards. It would cost too much, it would be too complicated to try and explain some of these ideas. And so I realized, I need to start learning it myself. In my master, I justified being not so great at German at the time because I was learning PHP and getting into other programming languages. And to me, that particular language enabled me to make web apps. So I could make, for the first few years, I was really focused on net art because anyone around the world could experience the piece. You didn't have to install anything. It lived in the browser. And so code enabled me to create things that I would never do by hand because it would just take too long. It's not only a time issue, but also it enabled me to change and try little experiments that if I did it by hand, I could only take so long to try one iteration, and then maybe that was right or not. And so, programming really became a tool to be able to try iterations and outcomes that I hadn't planned before. I would say every coder is a creative coder in one regard. So it's a creative act to code. The code itself can be very creative that we rarely or never see. There's a whole art to how one codes that unfortunately is for the most part hidden to us. But the creative coding aspect, using it towards art, I find to be, especially interesting. The tools that are now available to us. I'd say it started also in the early 2000s with processing, which is iteration of math by numbers from John Maeda, to open frameworks, to there's a handful of tools that became available to artists and designers to get into code, and is sort of a toolbox, a medium that enabled artistic designers to jump into programming without the maybe as high a learning curve as it began with. And that way their ideas, their sense of aesthetic have a chance to come and be explored through code, where I often think, okay, a real programmer, when they switch to design or art, often blow me away with what they're capable of doing. But then there might also be artistic decisions or composition decisions that could be a weak point compared to their technical ability. And I have the opposite approach, where I've studied and am more focused on the visual side, and then code enables me to test visuals that I would never make by hand. I can reach a certain level through my code, my ability, constantly learning, it gets better and better, but I'll still be limited compared to the person who studied computer science. But we're both actually coming to a certain meeting point as they explore possibilities through art and code, and we explore code for art. I think we're all sort of reaching this similar playing ground, and have different strengths that come together. Yeah, the driving force for using code to make my works, I would say, is to create outcomes, visuals, images that I would have never done without the ability of code. So in various works, I find a success when I've created something that surprises me by setting up the conditions, the situation, a set of rules with a set of chance, and then the outcome can be an image that I couldn't have anticipated. So to me, programming enables myself to be surprised. That was also the initial investigation in Glitch, was to try and surprise myself, to see visuals I hadn't seen before, to see outcomes that weren't anticipated. And code enables, this process of a structure, rules, situation, and then let it run and see an outcome that could be great, could be not so great. You have to be a human and evaluate that. But it's really this realm of possibilities that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. It goes in both realms. There's works that I make where I have an idea and then it's about executing that idea. This particular work here, I would say I had the intention of there being the body form, there being the person, there being type merged with it on certain examples, but I don't anticipate, there's a handful of parts I can anticipate which letter comes at which point into the image, which part of the loop is overwritten with the other, and so the rhythm that's created is a surprise. In this case, the sound is being given some aspects of chance for the pitch, and so I'm constantly surprised with the soundscape to the image. In a work that's in L6 right now, there it's about two 3D or three-dimensional forms that are rotating and changing and shifting. In this piece, Form Bit, it was really surprising how often I saw images I couldn't have anticipated just based on giving a little input for one form, giving an input for a second form, and then through their rotation and space, it constantly producing. If I were to take a snapshot of what it was generating, I could have tried to make this in Illustrator or by hand, but I would have never come to that composition, but I can find it fantastic what happened at the right moment. And so, that falls more on the generative side of using code. I mean, I almost don't want to say a particular name, but various movements that have happened. I'm especially influenced by the early computer graphics that took place in the 50s and 60s, and through works that had to be everything from scratch, that a machine existed for calculating, and various artists came into play, Frieder Nacke, Jörg Naes, Herbert Frank, who figured out how to code and how to control this device to produce images, rather than plotting mathematical equations or using it for calculating what it initially had been made for. Figured out a way to use this in an artistic medium, connected with a pen on a plotter, and could make fantastic compositions. And now it's quite interesting that some of these aesthetics come back into play now. We have the ability to do quite similar things, only now with motion and interaction, and to have things be drawn in actual time rather than, okay, here's the code, and now we have to wait, and a couple hours later it'll be produced. That's also a nice process. But now we get to take advantage of it's drawn and it can move. And so I think a lot of what was explored back then is still very relevant today, just adding these new elements on top of it. Yeah, quantization in motion is a further step of a work that I did in my thesis. Back when I was exploring what happens when we manipulate a picture, particularly the instructions, the body or the header of an image. I was playing with Muybridge's Horse in Motion because of its classic example of being able to really show what motion can capture. We got to see the horse up in the air, so it was relevant to take these 15 frames and to use them as the basis for manipulation, because while we could see the motion in this clip, could we see the manipulation and artifacts of the glitch? And so back then in 2008, with my lack of programming skills, I was going through and changing each of these little bytes one by one, and it took about a half hour per an image. And then I wrote a little keyboard macro, and that could do about 5 minutes per an image. And then I wrote a little bit of code, and that could do a few hundred images in a few seconds. And in that case, I could do a still frame of the horse in motion and let it sort of animate this manipulation that I was testing out. But I couldn't do the full trotting of the motion. And then later, with enough programming abilities using this program processing, I could go through and generate every manipulation to a single byte that I wanted for all 15 frames in all of these steps. And in the end, I think it was over 600,000 images that had to be produced to be able to see 15 frames of animation, the horse trotting, while this manipulation slowly gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And in the end, the horse is still visible, because basically what I'm manipulating is what's called the quantization table of the header, and this is where the computer tries through an algorithm to make slight compression artifacts that save space that the human eye doesn't really notice. And so there's special I would call them styles to the artifacts that they can do very carefully so we don't notice it, but each one of these, there's 64 spots, can be cranked beyond its normal non-noticeable state, and then we get to see these artifacts present. But especially through the motion, we can see the artifact and still see the horse moving, because through this multiple frames, it's still apparent what the video content is. I think it was in photography, in film studies in university, brought me to the respect for what this particular moment in photography history captured. This, I mean, from a bet to leading to a technological advance, the way that the horse, through capturing these individual frames and in motion, could prove that they sit all feet off the ground while running. And so that's maybe also a loaded example that has this historical context. But to me, what I was exploring, I thought these artifacts are also a unique attribute to motion, to digital images, to graphics, that such an example from history made sense, just to say, okay, that historical time, let's bring it up to today and see what other kinds of layerings can happen to the moving image.
I don't see that.
Yeah, I would say in the majority of the works, there is emotion involved, or interaction, or a time as an aspect. And one answer to why that's the case would partially be because those are the possibilities that we have today. And so I play in that realm of, we can make a work that involves time and can involve the user and the visitor. And so why not bring them into the work, let them play a role in the piece. In some works, it also involves maybe a printed element or a static element that's part of the output of the piece, which then is that moment in time frozen that can be investigated, because that's also an interesting aspect, that this happens to be a looping moment, but in general the pieces are maybe volatile, that there's that moment you saw it and then you won't get to see it again. And so in some cases, having a type of printing technology attached to it gives me the chance to say, yep, you saw that, it went away, here's a record of it. And so I'm often playing with different forms of printers, thermal printers or pen plotters, to enable an image to also be coded, printed by code, and play a role. And I'm very open to the idea of having a work that's interactive or so, having a final output that could sit static on the wall. But I think the possibility of it continuously evolving, growing, changing is fascinating for me, and maybe that comes from my interest as a viewer in a work in a museum. A video work is great. If the loop is too long, then I have to really be into it to invest the time, versus a still image. I can say how quickly I take the piece, do I spend with the piece, and when it is evolving over time and there isn't a time element, but it is ever changing, and I can also decide how long do I interact with this piece, or do I go away. There's not a fixed loop of duration.